Hello and welcome to EDHREC Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, I hope you won't take umbrage with Umbris. Umbris Fear Manifest has neither fear nor manifests anything, but it's a bonkers commander nonetheless. It's a 5-mana nightmare horror that exile mills our opponents till they hit a land whenever it or another nightmare or horror enters our battlefield. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger for each card our opponents own in exile. Yeah, that's one of the most absurd lines of text I've read in years. With the help of just a few other nightmares and horrors like the ones we're seeing in Umbris' EDHREC data, it grows to absolutely obnoxious sizes. I cannot overstate how swiftly Umbris grows into a lethal source of commander damage. Let's see what all Umbris is working with by taking its average deck from the average deck feature and importing it to the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. What a nightmare! Umbris' favorite movie genre is definitely horror. This is a stacked list, and when I first pulled it up, I didn't think I'd want to make that many changes to it at all. However, as I slowly got more and more experience with this commander, I began to notice a few nagging worries in my peripheral vision, little shadows and concerns that eventually formed into all-consuming terrors. Okay, I'll cut it with the histrionics, but yeah, there are some interesting things about this deck that aren't obvious at first glance. Small, lurking problems that are obscured until you look really closely, which is admittedly kind of poetic for a commander that's all about fear. To quickly affiliate ourselves with Umbris' core cards, we obviously have a lot of nightmares and horrors here, which trigger our commander. And some of these cards are just cool cards in their own right. Hullbreaker Horror is obnoxious. Toxrill is ridiculous. Grazilax is a subtle standout, threatening to put our creatures back into hand if they get blocked, which means we can trigger Umbris all over again when we replay them. Thing in the Ice is a horror that flips into a big, scary, awesome bouncer. That Mind Flayer Secret Lair card is going to get a different in-Magic version of itself someday, but for now, it's just a weird-looking beefy thief. My favorites are actually the little guys, the Dread Presences or the Ravenous Chupacabras of the world. And I forgot that Spellskite was a horror. That's really cool, which is important because Umbris draws a lot of attention to itself and it needs all the protection it can get. Heck, that Nightmare Shepherd is hilarious for exactly this reason. If Umbris dies, we can exile it and get a 1/1 copy of it. And that's fine if it's a 1/1 because the copy will still have the pump up effect and thus be a huge walloping monster. And it'll even trigger again when it enters the battlefield. Hilarious. It's not just about using our creatures to exile things, though. This deck is my personal worst nightmare because it is packed to the gills with graveyard exile effects. Leylines, Relics, Planar Voids, Doughty Voidwalkers, Ashiok, Bojuka Bogs, Scavenger Grounds. It's just so devastating to a Necromancy player like me. With these, Umbris climbs to 20, 30, 40, 80 power without breaking a sweat. And there are a lot of little ways to abuse this too. Oblivion Sower can power out our mana by pilfering from exiled lands. Sire of Stagnation draws cards and happens to fuel Umbris at the same time. And even the removal spells like Reality Shift and several others will exile their targets, giving Umbris tiny extra bumps here and there, which is really just a twist of the knife. However, the most important ingredient, in my opinion, are the unblockability effects. Rogue's Passage, Whispersilk Cloak, Aqueous Form, these are monumental. Umbris will climb to 21 plus power in a very short amount of time, but we need evasion to get that big swing through enemy lines. And that, I think, will segue us right into our upgrades. Let's tackle this list in the following 3 ways. First, a section I'll call Bump in the Night. Second, Recurring Nightmares. And third, the Total Eclipse, aka our win cons. Let's start off by investigating that bump in the night. You know when it's midnight and you hear that creak or that bump down the hall, but you're not entirely sure if that was just your imagination? Well, I don't want that to happen to our opponents. Not at all. I don't want them to wonder whether we're a threat. I want it to be crystal clear that we are definitely a very foreboding presence that should have them hiding under the covers. How do we accomplish this? By simply improving some of the basic necessities. Our land count, as is often the case, is too low here. We're not consistently casting those 7 drops when we have just 34 lands, you know? I'm gonna suggest adding 2 fun lands to spruce things up. First, Bonder's Enclave. Our deck could use more lands, and it's nice to have something extra to do with our mana when we're hellbent. The card advantage suite in this deck is a little rusty, so extra card draw on a land is pretty cool. And the other land I'm adding is just hysterical to me, which is Clinic. I know I said it before, but seriously, Umbris gets so huge so flipping fast. Using this on Umbris could easily gain us like 40 life, and that is my conservative estimate. To add, we must cut, so let's start doing that. I'll confess that I have no love for Rogue class. I built a Rogue tribal deck and I didn't even want this card in that deck. It's just not that good, I'm sorry. In fact, I have a similar feeling for Cunning Rhetoric. The exile effect is cute, but not an actual deterrent that keeps people from attacking us. The goal here, like with the Rogue class, is admirable, since the exiled cards fuel our commander. But you're gonna hear me say this a lot, especially in Section 2, Umbris doesn't need all that much extra help. It takes a blisteringly short amount of time for Umbris to be lethal in combat. A few extra cards from an enchantment like this, which we can't even control, aren't going to make a huge difference, and most of the time, if we get a lot of cards off of Cunning Rhetoric, it's because we'd be dying to a lethal swing anyways. So yeah, not a fan, I'm gonna cut it. That same logic is also the reason I'm going to be a smidgy bit critical of some of our removal effects. Not all of them, I generally like what's going on here. But sorcery speed pinpoint removal can be tricky, so Ravenform in specific is gonna get the boot. Our removal feels fine to me without this, and some of our nightmares are doing removal already anyway, so I think we'll be okay without it. Oh, and last cut in this section, though this one might be a little weird to explain, but I'm also going to ditch the Dark Ritual. I could be wrong, but I think this is a situation where we see some of the influence from the more cutthroat and or competitive versions of Umbris amongst the average deck data. To my eye, this average deck isn't suited to that style, and it was my experience that this deck needed more consistent mana rather than a brief surge of it. Umbris draws a lot of attention, y'all. We may need to cast it for 9 mana at some point, you know? So that's actually why I'm gonna instead throw in a mana rock here that will massively help with this deck's more inexorable style of play. Midnight Clock. When the clock strikes 12, we refill the hand. That's good, because like I mentioned before, this deck could use some more card advantage. It gets an empty hand pretty fast. At this deck's pace, 7 fresh cards will launch us back into the game, ensuring that the nightmare will never end. And in fact, since this deck already contains a Windfall, I'm going to throw one more really good card in here, and that's Whispering Madness. Super fun to cast on an empty hand, and sometimes it's repeatable with the Cypher effect. But as a fun bonus, just like the Windfall, it can load up a graveyard, which one of our exile effects can use to bump up Umbris another 10 or 20 power. Alright, our deck feels a little less swingy and a little more zingy. The sun has set on this section, and we're fast asleep. But that means it's time for our recurring nightmare. So I'm gonna be cheesy here for a second. I hope you'll bear with me, but since we're talking about horror commanders, I guess I wanted to mention that one of my fears, one of my horrors or nightmares, is like making a total fool out of myself, and like giving you all horrible deck advice and just totally embarrassing myself. Like, really? Those are the cards you cut, Joey? Like that kind of thing. Yeah, it just kind of weighs on you. But the reason I bring it up here is because this next section, it occurs to me that it might look a little sus. But yeah, I don't know. These are just the things that I felt when I was playtesting. And I hope that this next section resonates with you in the same way that it resonated with me. So let's find out. Let's go. So I think my feelings on this deck's creature loadout can be described with the phrase, too many cooks. There are a lot of nightmares and horrors here, but over time I grew less and less convinced that we needed all of them. After all, Umbris triggers itself when it enters the battlefield. That's an important detail. And we of course do want some of these creatures because they're very good, but some of these horrors and nightmares just felt like duds to me after a while. For example, here's a big one. Consuming Aberration is bad in this deck. It appears in 61% of Umbris decks, but it is BAD bad. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in our opponent's graveyards. Yeah, about that. Our deck is hardwired to make this card a 0/0 that will immediately die, basically all of the time, because we are always exiling graveyards. Cut this card, I cannot recommend playing it here. After that, Chasm Skulker and the Phyrexian Obliterator and Revoker repeatedly failed to impress me, but I think these can be especially personal calls. For example, I didn't find that Chasm Skulker was super impressive personally, but I can totally understand why people like it. Revoker is a cheap creature to trigger Umbris, but I rarely found its actual effect all that impressive, but that could be a meta call though. And then there's the Obliterator, which has a hilarious ability, but I found it hard to cast reliably. If you have one, I totally see why it would be really appealing to play, especially if you can consistently get like an Urborg in play or something. But if you don't yet have an Obliterator, I guess I'm not personally sure that it's worth the money to go and acquire for this deck. And specifically, here's why I'm comfortable cutting out some of these creatures. Umbris gets so big, so flipping fast. I told you I'd end up saying it a lot, but I really need to press this point. Umbris is almost immediately lethal in combat. Playing horrors and nightmares just because they're horrors and nightmares isn't enough. We can afford to be choosy here. Again, these are all probably personal and or meta calls. If these are special cards to you, I totally get why. I'd just like to invite into the conversation the fact that Umbris doesn't need a lot of other creatures in its kitchen. It's usually the biggest creature in play by a country mile, and Umbris is a huge lesson in diminishing returns. After it hits 21 power, we don't need to go out of our way to make it 25 power instead. When Umbris is a 50-50, going to 60-60 is kinda moot. We can stand to lower the creature count and free up some room for card slots in other necessary areas. And as the cherry on top of this explanation sundae, I'm also going to end up cutting one more horror here actually, and that's Overcharged Amalgam. It's a counterspell horror, and that sounds really rad, right? Well, only kinda. It usually ends up exploiting itself, so we counter a spell and exile mill one opponent, which isn't the worst thing ever, of course, but it is a lot of mana to hold up, especially if we don't get to keep the creature afterwards, and especially if Umbris is already big and lethal. Having cheaper forms of interaction will matter to us more often than having one more horror. And I'll get to that interaction stuff in a second, but real quick, I'm gonna do one more thing and take a peek at our artifacts. So, Tormod's Crypt is a fine card, but it only hits one player. It's free, which is a really good reason to like it, but we still have 8 other pieces of graveyard hate in this deck already, you know? I prefer the effects that hit all players instead of just one player. Such as this here Lantern, which is, again, a cool card. But I personally found that I preferred the other version of the Lantern. It costs 1 mana to activate, but it draws a card when it does so, instead of making us choose between drawing a card or exiling everything. These are nearly identical cards, really, but what can I say? I like the card flow a little bit more. Alright, so now that we've removed the surplus nightmares, what am I replacing them with? Well, there's a ghostly flicker in this deck for a good reason. Blinking Umbris re-triggers the ETB effect. With like a Panharmonicon in play, we get that exile effect twice, which is pretty nutso. And there are some nightmares and horrors with ETB effects that we're happy to repeat, too. Heck, imagine the devastation we wreak when we've spark doubled Umbris and have 2 of them and blink them again. It's silly pants. But that's not even why I like Ghostly Flicker here. I like it because it protects our commander, and that's why I'm also going to add Displace and Teferi's Time Twist to this deck too. Umbris is a removal magnet. People really want to kill it real fast. And what better way to protect our commander than by bringing it right back, bigger and badder than before. Umbris dodging board wipes is pretty awesome, y'all. Nice big empty board is super fun to untap into. There's a reason I called this section a recurring nightmare. We don't need to diversify our nightmares and horrors, we can let Umbris take the spotlight. This is a very commander-centric deck, so let's support it and protect it as best we can. And you know what? On the subject of commander-centric decks, I think it's high time we turn to part 3 and invite our enemies to total darkness, no escape. Let's flesh out this deck's win conditions. So is this a mill deck, or is this a deck that wins with commander damage, or is this a deck that can win without ever having to go to combat at all? Well, the answer to all of the above is yes, all at once. But that does mean that we're juggling quite a lot, so we've got to be choosy, because some of these win conditions will be more efficient than others. We made a bit of extra room in the deck in section 2, but I still have 2 more cuts before I go ham and start adding in tons of fun win conditions. Let's talk about these mill cards in the deck. I'm going to start with 2 good examples I'm definitely not cutting. Tasha's Hideous Laughter and Maddening Cacophony are pretty good. Tasha's is an exile effect, and the Cacophony is a traumatize on all our enemies. If we exile all the graveyards after that, Umbris is literally going to be like 150 power. It's also flexible, if we don't want to kick it and just want a quick boost. But specifically, I like that Cacophony sets us up no matter what happens in the game. A weird quirk of Umbris is that it can get smaller as the game goes longer. When we eliminate one player, we'll lose the power buff from their exiled cards. So loading 40 cards into everyone's graveyard with the maddening Cacophony and then finding a way to exile all of them means that we never really need to care about whatever Umbris's power is again. Which is why I don't mind taking the extra step of needing to exile everything after we cast this spell, and that's why I like the spell in general. By contrast, we have Fractured Sanity and Mind Grind. I hemmed and hawed a lot about these cards, let me tell you, but ultimately I felt the same way about them as I did about the excess horror creatures. They're both fine, they just didn't wow me, I guess. They aren't bad cards, not at all, but they just felt like they also fell into the diminishing returns camp. And when Umbris is regularly already a lethal attacker, I felt like the mill plan was a distraction in comparison to something else that this deck needs pretty desperately. So now we add. You want to know why I'm interested in cutting some of those graveyard filler cards? Because I'm a twisted dude who likes Web of Inertia, that's why. Our opponents have to exile a card from their graveyard to attack us, and they literally can't do that, because we keep exiling everything instead. It's so mean, and I love it so much. We can't be attacked with Web of Inertia in play. I know, it's completely evil, but come on. Alright, the web was a can't lose card, but now let's add in the we win cards. You know how I mentioned Whisper Silk and Rogue's Passage earlier? Yeah, let's get more of that, please. Trailblazer's Boots, get your boot in here. Unblockable Umbris is the most important thing we can do, and there's not a single EDH player out there who's not playing non-basic lands. And that's not even the only pair of shoes I'm gonna add either. Winged Boots, we need you. Protection and evasion, music to my ears. What about the times when combat isn't an option though? What if we're just stuck here with a 50-50 Umbris that can't get through a successful attack because our opponent's defenses are too great? Well, in that case, here's my proposed replacement for that Mind Grind that I cut earlier. How does a Rite of Replication sound? Casting this on Umbris means that we'll get 5 copies of it, which will, of course, immediately die to the legend rule, but every one of them will trigger on themselves and for each other. That's 6 Umbrises, each seeing 5 Nightmare Horrors enter the battlefield. Yeah, that'll mill out an enemy pretty darn good. But that's not all. I cannot end this video without adding my 2 favorite cards for this deck. The very first cards that sprang to my mind when I first laid eyes on Umbris. Essence Harvest and Rite of Consumption. Holy crap, these cards, they are so good. Yeah, here's my casual 60-60 Umbris just chillin'. I'm gonna dome you for 60 and gain that much life. Rite of Consumption is the black version of the card Fling, so you know what that means. If we cast it with Umbris, we are literally throwing shade at our opponents. It's beautiful. That's it for the official swaps, but now let's do some honorable mentions. This is a pricey deck, so what if you wanted to play it a bit more budget-friendly? I promise it's easier than it looks. For instance, cutting just these 3 lands and replacing them with basic lands would save over $100. So, you know, that's huge. And after that, here are the 5 most expensive cards in the deck, and those combine to another $150 or so. So for those doing the math, yeah, literally half of this deck's price was wrapped up in just 8 cards. You'd save over $250 by ignoring just 8 pieces of cardboard. I think that's a big lesson. Don't let a deck's total price tag mislead you. There are usually just a few culprits responsible for the biggest price fluctuations in a deck. In any case, here are some ideas you could potentially pursue instead. I'm definitely a fan of adding more unblockability effects to this deck. Simple spells can be really surprising, and Douthie Embrace in particular gives Umbris Shadow, which is just perfect flavor. If you want more horrors, not less, then Call of the Nightwing is pretty funny, I gotta admit. It makes a horror token, and you can cipher the spell onto that token, so it can keep making more of them. I think it's fair to keep tinkering with the mana acceleration in this deck too, if you need more mana rocks to power Umbris out sooner and help you recast it more consistently later on in the game. More blink effects won't go amiss either to keep Umbris from being killed. A card like Malakir Rebirth would also fit the bill there too, helping keep Umbris alive even through board wipes. And hey, speaking of board wipes, Evacuation could be a pretty good one to add in here. We won't really mind replaying our creatures for more Enter the Battlefield triggers, you know? Oh, and finally, I came really close to adding in Veil of Secrecy to the main deck. Protection and unblockability is just really flippin' good versatility. Alright, now to the inverse. What if you want a more luxuriant deck for your Fear Manifest? Well, I'm first going to acknowledge that there are competitively minded builds of Umbris out there, and others will know more about that territory than I will, but you can definitely take the lesson there of adding in a high density of fast mana if you want to get Umbris in play as soon as possible. And in fact, to take another leaf out of that book, I wouldn't be at all surprised if some Umbris players are excited to pair up Leyline of the Void in this deck with a Helm of Obedience, which of course has the effect of milling out a player's entire library with a single activation. But if you're not looking for competitive or combo, then there are still some good old punchy Umbris cards out there that you could add in too. Shizo Death Storehouse would give us evasion right from our mana base, for instance. Fierce Guardianship and Toxic Deluge are classics of the genre, and I'll point out that Deluge is especially spicy because you can often pay a bunch of life to shrink everyone else's field, and Umbris will usually still be big enough that even despite the shrinking, it can attack for lethal after the board is clear. On a related note, given Umbris' size, Shadow Spear is a hefty pokey stick that you might like to try in this deck too. Lifelink and Trample feels really good on a creature that's regularly over 30 power and sometimes is like 100 power. If you're hurting on card draw, Mystic Remora is yet another classic that this deck would love. This fish draws so many stinking cards. And if you like the blink a lot, then Thassa Deep Dwelling is another potential card to try, repeatedly pumping up Umbris, re-triggering other enter the battlefield effects, and tapping enemy creatures for both defensive and offensive purposes. But by far, my favorite cards to upgrade into this deck are the clones, Sakashimas in particular. Clones are super versatile, but like multiple Umbrises in play? I mean, maybe our opponents can deal with one 40/40, but two? They're doomed. Alright, here we are with our final list. You can find a link to this deck list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this nightmare of a video, and if you have any recommendations that you would make for your fellow Umbris players, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.